Before I pass the mic, I just want to introduce our speakers today. Jason Lange is the founder and president of BloomBoard, a talent development provider that supports school districts with educator pipeline advancement and retention solutions. Prior to founding BloomBoard, Jason worked in private equity and was also a member of the New Schools Venture Fund team, where he supported the development of the initial EdTech investment thesis for the New Schools Seed Fund, now Reach Capital. Amaya Garcia is director of PreK-12 Research and Practice in the Education Policy Program at New America. New America is part of the U.S. Department of Labor-funded Educator Registered Apprenticeship Intermediary. Amaya is a national expert on Grow Your Own Educator programs and policies. She leads New America's Grow Your Own Educators National Network, a professional learning community for GYO programs across the country. Thank you all for being with us. I will now pass the mic to Jason.
Lovely. Thank you, Erin, for kicking us off. Really excited about the conversation here. As Erin mentioned, I'm Jason Lange. I'm the founder and president for BloomBoard. I think the hope for this conversation was really to sort of share New America Amaya's sort of recent piece on sort of trying to clarify some of the confusion around sort of all of the moving pieces in these sort of new teacher prep pathways. And so we thought it'd be helpful to just sort of talk through what that looks like and then really dig in and sort of how what's working, what's not, where's the rub and where's the potential. And so I'm super excited about this conversation. I know we've had lots of district folks and state folks sort of come up and to sort of talk through it. And so let's just jump in. Thank you, Amaya, really for joining us here and excited to sort of jump in and have the conversation. Do you want to just kick us off and just sort of talk through a little bit of the sort of key pillars as you all have sort of identified them from the New America side? And I know you've got a couple slides here that you can sort of walk through to help that.
Yeah. You can go to the slides. I just want to start a little bit by talking about kind of how I started thinking about Grow Your Own. It's been something that I've been learning about for the past 7 years, and it really happened just by chance. I was spending a lot of time visiting dual language immersion programs where instruction is offered in English and a partner language like Spanish or Mandarin, for example. And one observation was that a lot of the partner language support and instruction is being guided by paraprofessionals in the classroom. And inevitably, principals would say, that paraprofessional would be an excellent teacher, but they face a lot of barriers to earning certification and leading a class. And so my colleagues and I became curious about that issue, about these barriers. And so we did focus groups with paras across the country in 5 different cities. And several sort of asked us, like in the conversation, like, why couldn't their school district start a program to help them become a teacher? And so I just want to share 2 of the quotes because I think they really do ground kind of when we think about GYO, what GYO is, but also just kind of why we want to do this kind of work. So one told us, they need us. We know the population of the school. We are native Spanish speakers. We have good connections with the families. And so that really kind of draws into when we're thinking about Grow Your Own. This idea that you're pulling people from the community who are familiar with what's happening in schools. They have significant experience working in schools. Lots of times they share cultural and other connections with families, and they are really already built this level of support that families rely on. And so why wouldn't we want to just advance them to help them keep growing in their career and to fulfill these vacancies that we have? And then, one person put it very, very direct. She said, growing and incubating new teachers, starting from instructional assistants who already know the school, know the family, know the student, know the teacher, and just have that pipeline. I think it makes so much sense in terms of district investment, time, and resources, right? So she said it very well. And so when we think about that, we're thinking about, okay, so we're bringing in school-based staff who have connections to the community, share characteristics, but we're also trying to remove these barriers into access and teacher preparation programs for people who have historically faced difficulties gaining admission or persisting because of all the other kind of circumstances in their life. So we're really thinking about some of these more non-traditional candidates or folks who are traditionally have been underrepresented in teaching. So you can go to the next slide and the next one, sorry. And so just to let everyone know, I am going to be talking about GYO apprenticeship and residency sort of separately at first, and then we'll tie them all together. And so what I have found and what other researchers have found is that there actually is not consensus on how GYO is defined, right? Mm-hmm. It's a very local strategy. People implement it in ways that they think make sense. What they can really kind of coalesce on is that you're kind of pulling people from the community. It can be a high school student. It could be a paraeducator. It could be a parent. That's actually where the roots are, and pulling in parents. and you can kind of support them in lots of different ways. But for us, in order to be able to do this work, we couldn't operate on just like, there's not really a definition. And so we pulled together a working group of folks who were researchers, practitioners, and kind of state leaders to kind of think through what we really think about mean when we talk about grow your own. So for us, we really think about grow your own as having a partnership between an educator preparation program, school districts, and community organizations that recruit and prepare local community members to enter the teaching profession and teach in their communities. It's sort of like a circular definition, but really this idea that you're developing these partnerships, that you're kind of co-creating these models where the school district's needs are going to be met because you're creating this alignment between this is a shortage area that we have, and this is what's happening in ed prep, because lots of times those two realities are divorced and they don't work in alignment. And so then we end up preparing maybe too many PE teachers when really what we needed was more music or art teachers, right? And so that's kind of how we think about it. It's partnerships, it's teachers from the community for the community is sort of like our little catchphrase. Next slide. So based on the research, so there's not a lot of research, I'll be honest, on the impact of GYO in terms of retention in the profession, in terms of student learning, but there is a strong foundation in terms of what kinds of features we want to see, what are impactful in terms of making sure that candidates feel supported and that candidates persist in the program, because that is obviously one goal, is you want to bring them in and you want them to graduate and enter a classroom. So strong partnerships, as you know, is part of our definition across all identities. And I think community organizations have more of a role to play here than maybe people give them credit for. We do have folks in our network, some groups that are entirely community-based organizations who have started programs in their communities by partnering with Ed Prep and partnering with the school districts to kind of leverage that change from within. For us, it's really also important that we want to be increasing the ethnic, linguistic, and racial diversity of the teacher workforce. That's been a priority for lots of states and districts for many years. And so if you're kind of doing this intentional recruitment, you're trying to make sure that the people you're recruiting in a teacher reflect the community in lots of different ways. And so that's why we like those high school students, why we like those paraeducators, because in general, paraeducators are more linguistically diverse, more racially diverse. Like they align a lot more with student demographics than some other than the traditional teacher workforce. These wraparound supports is a really big component of a successful GYO program. And we're talking about offering financial assistance. We're talking about test prep for those licensure exams. We need people to help you get into college, and we need people to help you get through college. And so there's lots of different kinds of supports that are necessary to help facilitate that successful completion. And a lot of times those are kind of offered on a one-to-one individualized basis. We also think paid work-based experience really matters under the guidance of an effective mentor teacher, and we want that alignment. So you'll see this paid work-based experience. We think it's important for GYO, we know it's important for residency, and we know it's important for apprenticeship. And then the last is a structured pathway for candidates to earn the required credentials and certification. So what you see is if you're just a paraeducator and you want to become a teacher, maybe your principal can help you find a program. Maybe you're lucky, your state has like a list of different offerings. But it might take you 6, 7, 8 years to earn that degree on your own because you're working, you're not getting the support, you're not getting kind of the guidance, the mentorship, all those things. And so we think it's really important that a GYO program offers that pathway, that you know that when you enter, maybe you have an AA degree, in 2 years you're going to graduate, right? People need to be able to see the end, they need to know what they're committing to, and they need to understand the things they need to do along the way to get to the end goal. Next slide. So in 2020, I did a scan of GYO teacher policies and programs across the country. I have been updating that scan every 2 years since. So this is the most recent data from when I just started looking at this, probably at the end of 2023, early 2024. And you can see that GYO has a lot of support, right? There are very few states that aren't offering some kind of policy or don't have some kind of funding dedicated. And when I talk about grow your own, I'm being a little broader when I talk about it in this context, right? I'm talking about those high school pathways, and they can be career technical education, they can be dual enrollment, they can look different ways. And I'm talking about some states, they call it a grow your own scholarship. I'm trying to be a little more flexible on this because we actually want this data to reflect the ways that people are thinking about and applying grow your own in their own context. So this kind of growth, I think, is very substantial and interesting to see when we don't necessarily have a lot of research, but I think that's okay. One thing that I try to point out a lot about grow your own too is that it's more of a conceptual framework than a specific model of teacher preparation. It's kind of a catch-all term. There's an interesting new study from Danielle Edwards and Matthew Kraft. It's a working paper that just came out that looked at Grow Your Own and found that similar thing. It's sort of an umbrella term. People are using it to do lots of different things. And like I said, we have career tech for high school. We have dual enrollment. We have a very small number that are utilizing like youth apprenticeship to try to get kids exposure. So program in Colorado, they get to work as paraeducators while they're actually in high school, because in Colorado you can be 16 and be a paraeducator. And so people designing pathways too, so that they can take their parapro while in high school, pass it, and then get into a career in paraprofessional, and then hopefully in a different pathway. So I haven't run the numbers yet for this year, but in 2022, 47 states in DC offered some kind of like GYO pathway for high school. They're the most prominent that we see. But then we have all these models for increasing access for adults. So 40 states in DC offer at least one GYO program focused on supporting paraeducators and becoming licensed teachers. That is a little different. When I talk about that 40 states, I'm not talking that there's 40 states, it is now, but like I'm talking about like that they have money, that they have policies. And so we're thinking kind of more broadly about that. And like I said, there can be scholarships. So New Mexico has a Grow Your Own program, but it's basically a scholarship program where the money goes to the higher ed institute. You apply to that higher institute, they award you the money kind of under this. We have ones that are those formal partnerships. So I've written a lot about programs in Washington and Oregon that are more structured that way, where we have the EPP and the school district working really close together, working on bilingual teachers, working on a specific shortage area. And then offering those comprehensive wraparounds. We have other ones that use residency. And now with this rise of apprenticeship, we also see this merging of programs being called GYO Teacher Registered Apprenticeship. Let's see. So this is kind of what we're going to have with GYO. So the big takeaways is that GYO is sort of an umbrella term. It can mean lots of different things. We have our definition of it where we really want to emphasize the partnerships, and we want to emphasize those community-based candidates who are going to teach in your schools and stay teaching in the schools. That's a huge assumption of GYO. We see a lot of investment and policy at the state level. And so that's kind of how we're thinking about it. So you can show the next slide. Now we're going to move on to educator registered apprenticeship, which has seen an explosion of interest in adoption since January 2022, when Tennessee announced that they were the first state to receive approval from the U.S. Department of Labor. New York State actually beat them to it in that they got their state apprenticeship agency to approve the program in the fall of 2021. So those are the two states that kind of helped start this. This is as of the end of last month. And this is all from the ERA intermediary. I'm really lucky to be a part of that. So we can see we have 2,500 active apprentices. And what's interesting is most of those apprentices are just from a handful of states, right? And we have 32 states in Puerto Rico who have registered a program. But as you can see, registering a program doesn't mean that you actually have apprentices, doesn't actually mean that you have anything up and running. It's just we're in the nascent stages. So even though we have some states that have a lot, there's still a lot of room to grow and room to understand like how these programs are being implemented, how they're being designed. And as I was talking about, some are kind of building off existing GYO. So Tennessee's program actually started off as a Grow Your Own program that was funded by grants from COVID recovery. They've transitioned to kind of more of an apprenticeship program, but then you see states like Virginia that actually call it GYO teacher apprenticeship. So assuming that it means that they're recruiting these community-based candidates and that they're giving them this apprenticeship. And so while teacher apprenticeship may utilize the GYO framework, it's not a defining feature of apprenticeship, right? Like this community-based recruitment, this removing barrier, like those kinds of aspects are not what we think about when we think about apprenticeship. Next slide. So these 7 components are what we think about when we think about apprenticeship, right? So they're industry-led. That's part of what's different about this when we think about alignment with K-12 teaching, with principals. That means that they're employer-driven, right? So the school districts are really supposed to be in the driving seat when it comes to this. They're supposed to be identifying that we have this need, we have this shortage area, we have these vacancies, and they're supposed to be kind of trying to figure out how to find the right EPP partner, create that alignment, and make sure that they're preparing the candidates they need. The next one's paid job. On the paid job, on-the-job learning, mentorship, and supplemental education are really big components of this, and some things that make them stand out a little bit from things like residency and GYO. So apprenticeship requires that you're paid a progressive wage. So you must have like at least one wage increase throughout the course of your apprenticeship. And there's some, there's some new regulations being proposed by the Department of Labor, which would actually make it so that by the time you enter your apprenticeship, you would be earning 75% of what the journey worker or the actual person in that job makes, which I don't know how feasible that is for education, but there is this idea that as you master skills and competencies, you're going to earn more money. On-the-job learning and mentorship, we know, is really important. You're working under the guidance of a mentor or teacher, learning as you go, and that should be aligned to your supplemental education, which is going to most often be offered by an ed prep program. And then we think about diversity, quality, safety, and nationally recognized. So diversity is something that's important to the Department of Labor. It's something that we're working on education. And so that's a good alignment. Quality and safety is there, and then the nationally recognized credential. So this isn't that you get your teaching credential, which is obviously a goal, but you actually get a credential that says that you completed a teacher registered apprenticeship, and that that's supposed to be portable. You're supposed to be able to show that you did an apprenticeship from Tennessee to Ohio, right? But that is not the same thing as the credential we talk about to actually work as a teacher. Let's see, and then we'll stay here for just a second. So these requirements mean that there's some level of standardization in how programs are designed, which isn't something we see in GYO, and not even necessarily something you see in residency, because we don't even really have a set definition of residency either, right? And so we have this sort of to register, you have to have these things, and these are important. But even with this sort of baseline level of standardization, the emerging programs have unique features that are aligned to like their state or local context. And so we can go to the next slide, and this kind of also from the intermediary, thanks to them, this shows like these entry points right into these K-12 teacher reps. So we're starting, you can have like a high school student who's going to do dual enrollment coursework. They're going to come down, they're maybe going to start college, right? And then, but that's another point, is like people who have some college, and then you have people with a bachelor's degree. So you really are creating these different entry points. You're trying to, and these are all, different based on what state you're in, what district you might be in. There's not like one pathway that's being used with apprenticeship. We are seeing these different points. And next slide. This, I just wanted to share this too. This is research conducted by the Registered Apprenticeship Intermediary that should be released soon. And this is just to kind of show the kinds of programs that we're seeing nationally. So you can see like some people are earning a master's, some people are earning a bachelor's, some people are getting a post-bac certificate. We have different kinds of sponsors, right? So some are ed prep programs, sometimes it's the district, sometimes it's the state education agency. So the sponsor is really kind of the one who oversees a lot of this, and they're who you like submit stuff to register. And we see different kinds of numbers enrolled, not many completers yet, except for like in Tennessee, because these things are emerging. And so this just kind of is to give a snapshot of the variety we see happening and the different sectors. So not only do we have K-12 teacher, we also have teacher's aide, right? And so there are some states where you have to be certified to work as a teacher's aide or paraprofessional. And so they're building apprenticeship programs for that. For principals, there's, I think, 2 states, maybe 3 now, that have K-12 principal roles. We also maybe see there's pathways for early childhood educators. There might be pathways for CTE teachers. And so we really are expanding kind of this universe of apprenticeshable occupations within the education sector. Next slide. So now let's think about residency. So obviously teacher residency and teacher apprenticeship overlap in significant ways. So they both have the intensive clinical training under the guidance of a mentor teacher. They offer aligned coursework, and it leads to, a residency always leads to a degree and/or state certification, right? Whereas GYO, there's no guarantee that you're going to get a degree, because depending on where you enter, like if you enter in high school, there's not necessarily a pathway for you going to get a degree. And in GYO too, and residency apprenticeship also, you might just get a post-bac certificate, which isn't the same as earning your BA or MA, right? Residencies always also utilize partnerships, but like historically they've been offered at the graduate level. We do see some more emerging undergraduate level programs. Louisiana is going to require that all in-state candidates complete a 1-year teacher residency, regardless of whether they go through, a traditional or an alternative route into teaching. And, we do have some information about like what we want to focus on in teacher residencies according to National Center for Teacher Residencies. You want culturally responsive recruitment. We want rigorous selection and support of mentor teachers, intensive pre-service preparation, aligned induction support, and strategic hiring of graduates, right? So we have all these sort of have these elements in mind. But as you can see from this slide, overall teacher residency has not received the same. It's taken a while, right, for it to build that same level sort of impact or interest from policymakers and from on the funding side as we have with something like apprenticeship and GYO. So we can see that, we had, I mean, it's grown too, though. We have, 11 states in 2019, and now we have 23 states in DC who have some sort of policy to support the development of of residency and like expansion. And then we have some states that don't actually have that legislation, but they have funding that they've set aside for this. And so it's interesting to kind of see how those comparisons stack up. Like it took 2 years to get to 33 states for apprenticeship, and it's taken a little longer on the residency side. So there is something about apprenticeship that seems to really be motivating people and driving people in a different way than we see even with GYO or with teacher residency. And residencies, the one thing I'll say that they vary in terms of how candidates are paid, how much they're paid, what kind of financial assistance are offered. But residency, unlike the other two, we have a little bit more research on that. And we have some research indicating it does lead to some better retention rates. It has, positive impact on teacher diversity. But with GYO and apprenticeship, obviously we don't have anything on because it's new. With GYO though, it's the research base is light. And so the next slide, this next one is a table that we put together, try to better understand kind of what we're talking about when we talk about these, but also to look across and see what features they have in common and what features really seem to make them stick out. And so with GYO, like I emphasize, it's this community-based recruitment, individualized support. And I think like the multiple pathways matters too, and apprenticeship, and that's like just part of like kind of the ethos of it. Apprenticeship does offer multiple pathways, but it's not like a guarantee, right? It's not like you're going to have one state that's going to have all these different on-ramps. It's the same sort of with the support. So like the half circle means like sometimes, and the full circle means all the time. But then apprenticeship, it's the only one that offers progressive wages. It's the only one that it's the only one that offers paid work-based learning, because residency, it's not like you're always going to get paid. You can see residency and apprenticeship both really have a focus on aligned coursework. They both also have like a minimum number of hours or years of work-based learning, which is not something that you see talked about when you talk about GYO. So residency, they really want it to be at least a year. And apprenticeship, it's by hours, right? So 2,000 hours, for example, would be what you would have to do. Different things about cohorts, culminating in degrees, and then preparing candidates for certification and licensure. So again, GYO isn't necessarily going to prepare you for certification and licensure based on when you're entering, because of how big that recruitment landscape is with high school students. And that's one gap that we see in GYO for high school students, is really that cultivation of that full pathway to get them from being a junior interested in becoming a teacher and actually becoming a teacher in their state. So I know I just shared a lot of information, but that's kind of how we've been thinking about all these different approaches and the way that they work in sort of complementary ways and what kind of makes them a little bit unique.
Love it. And so I think this has been super helpful just from a sort of clarifying lens about like, what's the what? I think as we've been sort of trying to sort of think through the broader lens, and so from the BloomBoard lens, like right now we're, I think, inside or in partnering or sort of helping in the process of like 5 registered apprenticeship applications in different states with different district partners. We're sort of working with sort of the higher ed, the Dallas colleges of the world to sort of power some of their sort of EPP-based apprenticeships, sort of grow your own pathways, intern residency pathways. And so I think it's been interesting to sort of get a pretty wide swath across our partners, district traits of like, where are things? And in particular, I think part of this question is like, there's a lot of effort and time that goes into standing up an apprenticeship and sort of managing all the work and the sort of designing the partnerships. And we certainly know, higher ed and school districts aren't always the best at partnering. And there's a lot of moving pieces in that model that we know sort of has sort of a lot of potential, but also a lot more logistical sort of needs. And so I thought it'd be helpful just to sort of try to take a little bit of a, state of the state at the moment in terms of the pathway and think about, across some of the key parameters that we see, or at least from a candidate's lens, right? Sort of what the candidates and what the districts are looking at in terms of how do I think about sort of where this work is today and where is its potential, and sort of what are the things that we sort of need to start to lean on. And so I sort of tried a little bit of a sense of just sort of putting some of these things on a bit of a scale to say, sustainability of funding, I think, is one that comes up every time in the grand scheme of things. And right now, apprenticeship, I think part of the reason it has grown so much is because it comes with this Department of Labor funding pool that has a lot of promise, or hope for promise. I think now getting into that, I probably have more concern than ever that like the sustainability of that is really hard to tap into because of the local workforce board involvement and the sort of cronyism that lives at the local workforce board, and trying to convince them to not fund or not allocate funds towards other vocational programs, other things that have been funded for decades, to now sort of make room for new apprenticeships. What we do know is that there is a lot of current one-time, right, SAFE grants, state grants that are really sort of propping up the structure. I mean, it's hundreds of millions, of dollars at this point. And so I think it'd be interesting just to get your thoughts. Like, if I were to sort of put the field right now in terms of like where things are, I think we're really heavily on the one-time funded sort of side of the work. And I think the hope is that, things like WIOA funding and formula funding around sort of apprenticeships, that can happen. It's happening in some tiny pockets, but the vast majority of people, I think, today that have actually registered apprenticeships, right, have not been able to access, right, sort of any of the WIOA formula piece. And that's a bigger question for the field, is just sort of how to really make that work. So I'm just interested, as you sort of think about, like, do you sort of agree with that? How do you think about sort of the assessment of like where that sustainability lives right now in the process across sort of that spectrum?
Yeah, I mean, this is the number one concern we hear from everyone across the GYO network, across anything, right? And I think apprenticeship was maybe pitched in the beginning as this way to get sustainability. But just because you register a program doesn't mean you get money, right? Like, registration just makes you eligible for additional funds from the Department of Labor, like the ones you have here, the state apprenticeship expansion formula grants, right? But that's money that's going towards all sectors of apprenticeship. It's not just going to education, right? And so it's really up to the states to decide if they're going to sort of prioritize that when they're applying for those funds. And in that last round, I have it here, of those grants are 35 of the 45 states that just got money in 2023. They included education as a priority sector. How that like plays out in terms of how they're allocating their funds is interesting. And then 5 of the 7 competitive funding awardees, so we have Kansas, Utah, North Dakota, Washington, and New Hampshire, indicated their grants would support K-12 teacher RAs, right? So even within these there's a formula within that, but then there's also competitive grants kind of built into that larger program. And then North Dakota is basically using all the money they got from that to invest in K-12. But again, those are grants, right? And those are, sort of one-time kind of situations. The WIOA thing, I think, is complicated because the WIOA, they can be spent on participants who are enrolled in WIOA through their local workforce boards, and these participants have to face at least one barrier to employment. So it's not like it's just anybody can access these funds. And so I think we have seen mixed results in terms of how those funds have been allocated for apprenticeship programs, because, as you said, like, a lot of it is tied up in the local workforce boards. And again, it's all about competing priorities. It's not like teaching is the only apprenticeship, like, there's lots, right? And so I think it's really tricky. And I think we're also at a very concerning time in terms of that the COVID money is drying up. And I know, at least for Grow Your Own, I think part of why we have that expansion from, I think it was 19 in 2020 when I first started this, to like the 40 or some now, right? Is because a lot of folks use those ESSER dollars to invest in this. And we already see some of that being backed away from. So like Tennessee, they had a competitive grant program that they funded with that money for GYO, that, like I said, a transition to apprenticeship. Those competitive grants are now gone. And so now it's really up to the districts to use sort of like existing federal and state resources to support these programs. The thing is, I think what comes down to too is that it's so much of it is contingent on what's available in your state. So New York State has come up with a sustainable model for funding teacher apprenticeship, but it's a structure that I don't think exists in other states, right? They have these BOSEs, these boards of cooperating educating service districts, and basically if two districts pay for like the same service from a BOSIS, so the BOSIS could be like, say they're the sponsor of the apprenticeship, then they can get reimbursed the next year for like the cost of that investment. So you can get like reimbursed up to 85%. That's not something that necessarily exists everywhere, right? And that's not even pulling like workforce dollars. And so I think like that's the other part that's complicated, is that because we don't have a national strategy for teaching, we don't have national investments in teaching, and so it really just comes down to what's available in your state. And so it all is gonna, I think a lot of it's gonna end up like the blending and braiding, right? Like I watched lots of webinars, I've seen lots of people talk, and the people from North Dakota talk about like, we're using our Title I funds for this part, we're using our Title II funds for this part. If we want to bring in ELs, we're using, and so that's really kind of, I think, the path to sustainability is that blending and braiding. But we also want to see maybe some policies that are more comprehensive, like that are working to reduce the cost of college overall. Like, are you going to do free community college, right? Like, why not make that happen so you got that kind of knocked out? And then people are doing like these last cost in models where you're basically having the candidate apply for all the financial aid they could possibly be eligible for, and then you just cover the remaining cost, because the districts usually are able to pay their salaries and stuff from existing positions that they have, right? And so I think that it's really about that creativity. But yes, I'd say that you're right, that we're not an ideal yet, but I think that we do have some pockets where people have developed these sustainable models. And so how much can we learn from them and how much can be applied to other contexts, I think, is the open question.
And Aaron, I think to your question in the chat, in the Q&A there, I mean, I think right now it's actually the WIOA funds, because it's such a local decision, it's actually not even state necessarily allocated. There are state set-asides and states are trying to figure out some of those pieces, but it's actually all the way down to the county local workforce board. And it really comes down to their priorities and their relationships and sort of how to lead to it. So it's not clear that adding teaching will make funds more competitive. It really just depends on sort of the relationships. We know there are workforce boards who've said they'll fund, large, 40%, up to 50% of candidate wages for programs that can sort of help manage the process. And there are others who've said, they have a lot of other competing programs and they're working on tech. And so it's not a high priority strategy. And so I think it's just really going to shake out in terms of what that ultimately looks like. I think the one of the other parameters that comes up quite a bit is really around this like accessibility model. Again, I think people have really been trying to push on apprenticeship as a new form of accessibility to help sort of open the market to adult learners, to parapros and the like. I think what we have found to date is the early adoption, the early models have been mostly sort of, higher ed hosting nights and weekends courses, right? Sort of on site and sort of using some mechanism to say like, well, we can try and close the gap a little bit. But what I think we're really finding is there's just frustration in the candidate pools about the fact that, right, if you've got a family at home or if you've got, right, a second job because you're working and living off a para educator's, right, $24,000, right, sort of salary, that's a really hard lift. And so it actually goes to sort of the sort of earlier question around just duration. And I think we're finding that there's a lot of still barriers that exist in the program, that are really trying to navigate this. Obviously, from the BloomBoard lens, like our world in this has been trying to help higher ed figure out sort of really fully on the job coursework. And so we sort of have been working with partners to think about what is the new version of an LMS, the new delivery model of the higher ed component of the apprenticeship, RTI, sort of residency model that allows it to actually integrate the coursework entirely into the actual job. So there's no nights and weekends, sort of courses, in the sort of the normal model, which could be a really sort of big boon in terms of access. But I just think we're still early on in trying to find sort of a way that can be sustainable, because I don't think we've still gotten and cracked the nut on just the accessibility of the programs, because there's still quite a bit of barriers at the candidate level. So I'm just interested in what you've seen there in the sort of accessibility side of things.
Yeah, I mean, definitely we see a lot of programs being online. And we don't know a lot about online teacher prep. It hasn't been studied that much. And so that's another like emerging research area to really think about. One thing that I think that's interesting is Missouri State University. They kind of started this on their own. They registered on their own. They do this prior learning assessment model where they can get up to 24 credit hours by demonstrating proficiency on these prior learning assessments. And so really kind of leveraging that competency-based side of this, and recognizing that these are people who've been in this field, they're professionals, they've done this work. And so I think thinking more about that too is like, how do you actually offer credit for prior learning? How do you integrate that to kind of reduce some of that burden of coursework and to really kind of make it more aligned with the way that we want these systems to operate?
Well, I think it actually relates to the third sort of parameter, which is like the speed of completion, which, right now, I think we've seen a sort of pretty good interest in the sort of process. I think we know that sort of the candidate sort of, attrition there has, depending on the program, right, is sort of all over the place. We don't have a ton of completion data yet. I think the timelines, at least what we've heard sort of anecdotally, is that timelines are pushing out longer than we would like them to because life, frankly, happens. Certainly the PLA option, I know we have, right, there's examples like College Unbound and sort of folks who are doing, life experience credit in interesting ways to try to sort of give more credit. One of our higher ed partners, Lake Erie College, they're actually able to sort of confer, sort of some of that on the job credit from portfolios that you're working on in your practice. And so it's able to sort of create, in their case, they're actually able to create a sort of an accelerated pathway to be able to sort of get, depending on your, depending on what level of credit, whatever their sort of pros, but like, what would it look like if you could actually do an entire 0 to 120 bachelor's degree in 3 years? And how would that look if you could actually start to accelerate some of the timelines? Again, I think, Nakia, this goes to sort of your question around, where are the parameters, where are the drivers that can sort of actually help manage the duration of these programs? I think right now in the mainstream, we're still in this, a little bit TBD to figure out like, how do we make sure that the programs can actually get sort of more candidates through, at least at the same time, if not faster. But again, now you're sort of adding all the credit requirements of if it's a bachelor's degree or a master's degree to a full-time employed workload. And we know that that's just a lot of extra work, right? And so getting 60 credits of coursework done, of college credit done while you're working full-time, that's pretty hard for, even sort of the most dedicated candidates possible. And so if you throw families and throw nights and weekends, throw other things in there, it just becomes a much harder lift. And so we're still seeing, I think there's a lot of questions about, can that really sort of, ultimately fulfill the promise in terms of getting folks to a much more, sort of coordinated pathway, sort of as you talked about it earlier. I don't know if do you have thoughts on sort of where that is to date at the moment?
Well, I think the federal data from Rapid shows that it's like 67% of the people in these programs already have an AA or some college or a BA, right? Which I think is something to consider when you think about the speed of completion time and who's kind of being prioritized for access into this. And some of those people with BA are getting an MA. Maybe they don't need to get an MA. Maybe they really just need that post-bac certificate, and then they can get an MA as part of the professional learning, as they move on through the profession, right? I don't know that it has to happen necessarily up front. I think it depends on like what that value add of the MA is versus you getting a post-bac certificate while completing an apprenticeship in the classroom for a year, right? And so I think like we're still kind of thinking through what those like traditional endpoints are. Like if you have a BA, then that means that you get an MA, but maybe it doesn't necessarily have to mean that, I think. But I also think that we want it to be, at least a year, at least 15, whatever. We want them to get enough experience like in that clinical training and with the mentor teacher so that it kind of pays off. And so that when they do enter the classroom, they don't feel like a first year teacher and they kind of have a little bit more confidence under their belt. And so I think there's just a little bit of balance that we need to think about when it seems like terms of speed of the completion time.
Love it. Well, and I think, this is where obviously things are still early and trying to understand, right? The moment you start to think about the sort of the time to completion, then this question of like, well, how easy is it to complete? And what's this sort of caught up in the national credential? And how do we think about that when it comes to licensure requirements? I mean, I would say now, given that we have probably thousands of candidates across different master's degrees and bachelor's degree programs, the licensure requirements continue to be the biggest unknown and the biggest barrier, either from, transferring credits in, PLA credits. We know that the licensure bars and the sort of the problems that we have with just the testing regimen is just really brutal. And I'm not sure we know right now, we've definitely seen some of our higher ed partners do a lot better job trying to integrate test prep into very early on. So if it's a 2-year bachelor's, you start working on your test prep for your practice exams, even as early as your second semester. in the process because we know that those are going to be barriers. I think right now we're still in a little bit of space where we're sort of continuing to see, similar sort of results as the current alt cert pathways, which frankly just don't have great passing rates. And so the goal is, right, what does it look like to really sort of try to think about where the field needs to go and what it needs to look like in terms of trying to sort of think about what that future state will be in terms of easing licensure requirements or embedding licensure pathways in the process, because it's a much more job embedded sort of approach to be able to sort of show what great instruction looks like. I don't know if you've seen any movement there or any sort of progress.
Not really. I mean, I'm very curious to see how the data are going to bear out in terms of the success rates on first time passing rates, right, on these licensure exams for the apprentices that have completed. I think it's only like a couple hundred who have actually completed, but I don't know that we have that information. But I think that, across kind of definitely with GYO and apprenticeship, it is about building in that testing support early on and making it sort of like scaffolded and released a little bit. Like you might do a little bit more early on, and then as people get more skills and competencies, you kind of let them out of that side of it. But it's also going to be interesting. So one of the other things we're proposing for the changes to apprenticeship system are these endpoint assessments, and that would be for any apprenticeship. It wouldn't just be for education, and whether or not they're going to take any kind of the lessons learned from what has and hasn't worked in education on that. And then the other big thing with this too is making sure that you're covering the costs and you're trying to understand how many times people are taking these exams, who's paying for that, and kind of how you're aligning that too with like this whole system of emergency and conditional certification, right? Where we have people working in classrooms on these temporary licenses because they haven't been able to pass the exam, and can we design a system that tries to avoid that so we don't actually need to have sort of that level of like emergency, right, when it comes to how we're credentialing teachers.
Well, and it certainly feels like that's just coming faster and faster. And so I think the how to get out in front of that is going to be a big sort of pressing question in the more near term, especially as folks under provisional license, their times are coming up, right? And I know COVID extended a bunch of those, but that's going to sort of slowly reverse here, and we're going to end up in a harder place. Yeah. The last one that I thought was helpful in sort of giving a sense of like, again, from the candidate standpoint, right? Largely the candidate pool for apprenticeships and for GYO is mostly sort of this sort of Gen Z population. And it's been really interesting as we've started to dig into just the candidate pools to think about like, how does, right, teaching as a profession really think about, right, sort of an align to the Gen Z perspective on life, which is frankly just very different than the state of the world that most teachers and most administrators are coming from. And so I generally would argue like we're still in a very much sort of entrenched. I joke, one of our HR talent acquisition folks was talking to a teacher the other day who basically was like, look, what if you could just not pay me the pension and take the 12% that I would pay into the pension and like pay me that as a higher wage, and I don't need healthcare either, right? And so I'll go get that on my own, and like what could then my salary be? And obviously that's not a conversation a district can have a lot of flexibility in managing at the moment, but I think there is some interesting questions to say like, are there ways to align, right, sort of some of these pathways to a much more, right, education should be a great career for Gen Zers, at least as a training ground for that. And we know there's a bunch of data in terms of, right, some of the sort of new data that's come out from, some of the more recent ECMC surveys where we're seeing a lot more interest in people wanting to have an other option from a traditional degree, or wanting to have time for summers, right, for side hustles and other sort of things, or really thinking about, right, debt as this like very concerning problem that they're sort of thinking about. And I think what we're really trying to understand is, what does it look like to sort of have much more employer centric, right? We know districts are now competing with Chick-fil-A, right, and Lowe's and Chipotle and Amazon and Target. And most, if not all of those orgs are offering free college in some form to be able to go through it. And so the idea that we can sort of use these pathways as a way to really start to sort of create a more on-the-job version of those pathways, I think is really interesting and pretty exciting. But I'm just interested, have you seen much in that sort of frame on the, the Gen Z alignment, sort of at work across any research so far?
I mean, so when you asked me about this, I looked at a bunch of this research on what Gen Z people want, right? And so I found like these 6 things, right? So they want job stability and financial security, right? I think teaching, you can get job stability depending on how strict your evaluation system is. You can. Financial security is a little more mixed, but for people who are paraprofessionals, let's be honest, you're doubling your salary if you become a teacher. Paraprofessionals are some of the lowest paid staff members in schools. And so depending on your definition of financial security and a pension, some people like that, some people don't, right? And so it's a little bit opportunity, learning and development. And if it's designed, it is a field where technically you should be learning and developing as you grow, both like through like, standard professional development, but just like on the job. I think that teachers learn so much just by doing and from the experiences they have year to year. They want in person but they want flexibility. Teaching doesn't give you so much flexibility, but it gives you, the summers off. That's true. But I think the sticking point is they want the sustainable work-life balance. And that's what we haven't kind of unlocked yet with teaching, I think, as a career. What I'm starting to think is we're investing all this time and energy into creating these sort of more innovative teacher preparation models, but we haven't done like similar work of actually transforming the career of being a teacher. We have some like promising things like, like opportunity culture. We have the strategic staffing models that are coming out of Arizona State University. They're trying to transform the ways that schools work and the work that teachers do. But I think that we need to be investing more in what it actually means to be a teacher and modernizing it as a career, and not just thinking about how we're modernizing the way that we're preparing teachers to do it, but actually what's happening once they're there, right? And so I think it's like a wait and see. But what's interesting though is 75% of the people who are in apprenticeship right now are between the ages of 25 and like 55 or something. So we're tapping into sort of this non-traditional candidate pool. And so they are going to start overlapping more with the Gen Z, and we'll see kind of what happens as that plays out. But there is lots of opportunity. There is some alignment, but I think it's really just about being strategic about making it fit and understanding what we mean when we talk about retention, that we maybe aren't expecting people to be in the job for 30 years anymore. It's 5 years enough, 10 years enough, and then they move on. And there's a lot of people who started off as teachers and now have amazing careers in lots of other sectors and are making a difference that way.
And I certainly think, one of the ideas that like teaching and being able to sort of understand what a great teacher looks like is some of the best future-proof career skills you can get. And that is a way to sort of start to reframe some of this. Just in the interest of time, I know like we've got about 12 minutes left here. I think the other frame that we want to sort of try to figure out was like, what really matters, right? I know, between all the confusion of these different sort of structures, I think we've been trying to figure out like, what are the things that actually matter most to districts? And so when we've sort of had conversations about sort of district leaders and sort of tried to really sort of get a sense of like, at the end of the day, call a program whatever it is, right? Call it teacher pathways, whatever the case may be. At the end of the day, I think districts are really trying to figure out, one, how do I solve my shortage, right? And can I get more candidates in the profession? Because there are no longer enough 20-year-olds to staff schools based on the retirement curves that are in place. And so like, that's a scary future that hits in the next, 3 to 5 years. I think second is, right, where do I get new money post, ESSER dollars? Like, how is this sustainable, if at all? And what does that look like? And then, hopefully, I think most districts would ideally want to say, and how do I actually increase my actual educator quality, or at least make sure there's quality there and get better retention in it? And so I thought it'd be helpful just to try to sort of frame across these parameters, across each of these, like, what are the ways that we're seeing so far this play out, and what's been working, what's not, and that we can certainly just sort of talk through, what's been most helpful or what hasn't. I would say when we see the, from a grow your own perspective, the early data on access in terms of grow your own, right? High school, any district I've ever talked to that has been doing long-term high school recruitment into the profession, the retention data is not great, right? Because they're still high school students and they don't necessarily know what they want, right? And they're still trying to figure out life. And I think it's hard to sort of bank on high school students really becoming, sort of a long-term viable, or middle school becoming a long-term viable strategy for that. But it's certainly good exposure. I think we have seen a lot of interest. We have districts now that have 100+ person wait lists in their grow your own sort of community-based lens, which is classified staff, paras, parents. And so I just think that's been a really interesting focus as districts are trying to think about like, what's the best, Debbie, sort of your point, like if there's a goal for this meeting, it's like, what's the best ideal program that I think based on the data you could design to sort of build the future pipeline? It's one that certainly is sort of growing from within your community, your paras and parents and classified staff into future teachers, right? We know that really resonates. I think, when we sort of think about that access on the residency side, residency programs are still, still, right, not massive in scale, right? I think in total across even the National Center for Teacher Residency, there are a couple thousand candidates, across the country in that, 4 or 5 years that they've been sort of humming along. And so we just haven't seen a lot because, right, that alt-cert pathway is very real, but there's just, it's a harder career switcher. And then you get into sort of salaries and sort of comparative, right, costs across industries. And so there's some potential there. I think, again, what we have seen on the residency side is there is a lot of bachelor's degree interest, and that the idea that we can start to create pre-baccalaureate pathways and bachelor's degree programs into the profession that are in that residency model and leveraging a lot of that sort of wraparound supports, that's super interesting. And at the same time, I think we get into this, from a modality standpoint, what works. I think we know just empirically at this point, the more the online courses, nights and weekends, and the more hoops candidates have to jump through that look like traditional, even online schooling, that's going to drive away a lot of people or extend timelines into ways that are going to be much harder. And that the idea that you can start to have a much more job embedded set of courses is really compelling. And we're seeing, sort of really high 95+ completion retention rates in our sort of portfolio of higher ed partners that are building that sort of on the job structure. And so we've been pretty excited about where that's going. And then I think, from the apprenticeship lens, it's sort of funny. The apprenticeship models really are the grow your own residency models. And so in some ways I was like, it's hard to think about the apprenticeship as its own bucket because it often just is some Venn diagram of these two. But I'm not sure there's sort of unique, specific ways outside of new funding access, right, which is obviously down here, that like residency or that apprenticeship can sort of mount that. Agree, disagree? Like, how do you think about sort of this sort of at least sort of lens on the current, sort of offerings that are available?
I think that it's spot on about grow your own, about these parents and like this overlap with apprenticeship. We do see districts that just have so much interest in these populations and trying to like get that access. And I think that we should be focusing more on creating these pre-bac residency programs because I think we still have like a very fragmented system of teacher preparation, and most people aren't going to get to go through a GYO, a residency, or an apprenticeship, right? And so in order to kind of standardize some of those practices, you have to like integrate them better. You can't just make them these one-off. So like, I think it's in Florida, if you're already enrolled in a teacher prep program, then you can't actually do an apprenticeship program or something, like these like kind of barriers that make it harder for people to access them, to kind of institutionalize some of these practices, I think is one thing that I think about too when it comes to access, is how you're actually going to adapt these within the traditional system so that they're not just these one-offs that some people get to benefit from and other people's don't. Because if we're actually going to say that these models are based on, more maybe best practices, then we need to figure that out too. That's kind of how I've been thinking about it. But then also thinking about who's like being pulled in, and we do have, strong information about like residencies do bring in like higher proportions of candidates of color, GYO, depending on how it's structured in the state, we have sort of similar, and then just being able to provide sort of that wraparound support, because not only is it hard for them to do coursework, but sometimes it's hard for them to pay rent. Sometimes it's hard for them to find childcare. Sometimes it's hard for them to do that. And so I think that's another part of like the access to think about is who you're recruiting in, but how you're supporting them, right? Because it's not, you can't just kind of do one and not do the other, I think.
Exactly. And Scott, to your question around sort of examples. So I know with Point Park in Pennsylvania, right, we launched sort of a new partnership around a residency for their bachelor's degree in special ed and their bachelor's degree in elementary ed. And really the idea behind the partnership is how do you redesign the delivery model of existing accredited courses, right? So it's still university faculty run courses in, right, sort of the same content areas, the same sort of course IDs, right? It's just sort of swapping the learning management system sort of structure and the delivery structure of that same sort of often sort of theoretical framework, but swapping it for actual examples of practice. And so it's really asking candidates to use their day job as the fodder for their degree. And so there's less sort of theoretical lecture-based nights and weekends courses, if any, and really a much more of an emphasis on what are you doing in terms of your actual day job to show, the actual lesson plan, the video of you delivering that lesson plan, the student work coming from it. and using those artifacts. And so in our partnerships with our higher ed partners, right, it's actually a portfolio, very much a sort of a more portfolio-centric approach to conferring those 3 credit courses. And that's, I think, what makes it really exciting, is because faculty, higher ed is still running, managing, supporting, owning the implementation. But all of a sudden, we can sort of shift the design in the same way, higher ed went from an in-person to an online model, largely in COVID, right? Now, I think we're seeing higher ed shift from an online to an on-the-job model. And that's a really exciting shift because it can solve a lot of these access barriers that we're finding. Just in the interest of time, and from a sustainability standpoint, we talked a lot about, grow your own and sort of the state-specific funding there. Again, I think the concern is most of that is one-time budget allocations, and we don't know where that goes and how sustainable that will be. Similar on the residency side, again, the funding sort of allocations at the state level for master's degrees, there's some, but frankly, part of the problem is, right, there aren't federal aid options for master's degrees. And so a lot of what I think the potential in the bachelor's degree side also comes from is you're still now in a FAFSA Pell eligible, which does also match our candidate pool if we want to serve underserved candidates, right? Those candidates are largely going to be much more Pell and federal aid-able in the process, and that there's a lot more potential to help subsidize those programs using that federal aid that would then dip less into district coffers. And so that's sort of an interesting question. And then obviously part of the residency, the apprenticeship model is how do you compare, right? What funding is available through these state set-asides, through the grants that are available in these sort of more one-off instances. And, right, will we be able to figure out if the WIOA funding and the formula funding is viable? We spent a bunch of time earlier on that, so I don't think we need to just go to dig super deep into it here, but I think that there's still a lot of TBD, if not some early proof points that say, like, that's a really hard hill to climb, and that we're going to run into a lot more barriers continually as we try and do it. Mm-hmm. And then I think, as we think about sort of the final sort of, parameter here, which is like, as we think about increasing quality, right, and increasing in retention, again, high school students, we don't really have great data on what has worked and how long and how much they've actually sort of converted. And I think that the data sets of high school, sort of attribution and sort of, continuation into the programs is just early, or is just too small so far. I think, Maya, to your point, right, the early data on paras and parent and classified staffs, it does feel pretty good. Like, it's definitely early and positive in terms of being able to take folks from your communities and be able to sort of embed them and not only give them more of the residency-like experience, right? Because we do know fundamentally, like, the data on residencies is very strong, that it does increase quality and it does increase retention because candidates feel more prepared and they're actually just frankly sort of better prepared to do the job in classrooms. And so I think the early data there looks pretty good. The residency data there is already pretty resounding and pretty strong. And so then it's ultimately just going to be a question of, like, what is the efficacy and how does that translate into the, apprenticeship structure and how does that all work? Anything you would add there, or anything you add on the, either the funding piece or the quality side there?
I mean, I think on the quality side, we don't have a lot of research on these pathways in particular, but there is research that coalesces around the elements that they share, like student teaching is good for you, but actually there's not even like something that says like longer is better. It's more like you've done student teaching, you've worked with a mentor teacher that makes you feel better prepared. There's a lot of research showing but where you get placed really matters. Like, we want people going into schools that are positive, that have strong school leadership, strong collaboration amongst teachers. And we want that alignment, right? There's also research showing that alignment between what happens, what you're learning in your courses and what's happening in your clinical training matter. And so I think that we have a lot of really strong value propositions in here. It's just about making sure that we're implementing high quality programs and we're not sacrificing quality because we need this many more teachers or because we have this urgency, because none of these are going to work on the long term if we're not producing the teachers that folks need who are going to be effective, right? And so there's still a lot, I think, to be done on the research side to really better understand what those aspects of quality are, what we should be monitoring and paying attention to, and how we're trying to adjust as we go on to make sure that these programs are as strong as they can be.
Love it. Well, I know that this has been a lot. And again, I think the hope here is that we've been trying to sort of clarify and sort of highlight some best practices, highlight some things that we've seen early on in the data about what's working. Amaya, we really appreciate time, really appreciate the sort of thought leadership here. And I'm excited about sort of seeing where this all goes as we try to go from, current state to ideal state. And really appreciate everyone sort of as you all have sort of joined the conversation. Certainly if we can be of help in any way, right, sort of just clarifying what things we're working on. You've got our email addresses here. And so we're always happy to chat. But otherwise, thank you so much for the time, and we'll continue to sort of work on the good work.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.